Crysis 3 is the final game in the Crysis series, a series of games involving aliens, paramilitary forces, conspiracies, and soldiers that frequently ignore direct orders. Again taking place in New York after the events of the previous game, with the place really gone to shit, turned into a giant biodome controlled by the organisation called Cell. The protagonist from Crysis 2, Alcatraz, has been merged with another character named Prophet, who was the CEO of Nomad, whom the player controlled in the first game. You might also remember that at the end of the second game, Prophet merged with Alcatraz in a unity I like to refer to as Alca-Prophetaz. So anyway, now Alca-Prophetaz is working with Psycho, another character from the first game, to infiltrate New York, engaging with the PMC group Cell in the process. And then they end up waking up the Alpha Ceph as shit again hits the proverbial fan.
The Alpha Ceph.
At one point you work with a resistance group led by a scientist portrayed by Wolf Kahler. Wolf Kahler is that German actor who played the asshole Nazi officer in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He also played an asshole in Barry Lyndon. This guy is real good at playing assholes, it seems. Honestly, the story in these games has never been their strongest points, but one thing they've always done pretty well is write humorous banter between all of the supporting characters. And the voice acting in general is pretty damn good.
Prophet, you okay? Yeah. That was fucking awesome!
On a positive note, this is easily the best looking game in the series. Learning from their mistakes with Crysis 2, Crysis 3 goes back to its roots of being a visual powerhouse, and another great benchmark for PC rigs.
Oh yeah.
The character models, the environmental effects, the lighting and the texture work is some of the best you're ever going to see, and it doesn't just tread into Uncanny Valley, it drives right on in. The rain-soaked areas of the prologue and the first time you step foot back into New York are two particular standouts. The voice actors for the main cast have had their likeness adapted into the game, and some of the cinematics really do feel like you're watching a film. It looks that good.
I can't get a read on you.
Oh, come now, Lawrence, what did you expect? I designed your suit, my dear fellow, of course. It can't get a read on me.
I've also always enjoyed the soundtrack in these games, and Crysis 3 again also has a phenomenal score. Now, the gameplay follows largely in the same vein as Crysis 2, throwing you into these semi-open yet still linear environments with the nanosuit and a few key abilities. The suit's basic abilities are an armor and a cloak mode which renders you all but invisible. There's another upgrade system in place where you can upgrade components to the suit to give you benefits like increased energy recharge rate, resistance to damage, and all the other cookie-cutter upgrades you'd expect from a game that's pretty much set in autopilot mode. This was a period in gaming that was the era of the bow, with games like Far Cry 3, Tomb Raider, and The Last of Us, and again we've got one in Crysis 3 in the form of the Predator bow. It can take a bit of time to get used to the way the arrow drops off over long distances, and you can even modify a few parameters of how it functions, though I found the default setting more than useful as is. The basic arrow will kill most enemies in a single hit without having to modify anything at all. But messing around with the alternate arrows can offer up some cool opportunities, like firing an explosive arrow into a cluster of bad guys, or an electric arrow into a pool of water, for instance. What makes the Predator bow the most useful is that it doesn't drain your energy when you're cloaked, as most of the other weapons do. With other guns, you're forced to kind of pop out a cloak for a second, take your shot, then pop back in. To counter this, it seems they've given you very limited ammo, so you generally only have, I think it's like 8 standard arrows and 4 of the other special types. But still, this thing is crazy overpowered, and with the upgraded nanosuit, it makes certain sections laughably easy. And this is really the only new addition to Crysis 3 overall, and it feels very similar to the point that it often comes across more like Crysis 2.5 than it does Crysis 3. But then again, you know what, this isn't entirely a bad thing, and the reason for that is that these are those wonderful types of games that give you this real sense of freedom to tackling your objectives. Yeah, it's still very linear in the sense that you're always going to end up at a certain place and something scripted is always going to happen, but the way you get to that point is left entirely in your hands. You really do have to play these games on the hardest difficulties, because on the easy or normal modes, the damage you take from enemies is just a slap on the bum more than a real threat. On the higher difficulties, you can still survive gunfire, but not in the same capacity, and it actually forces you to move around and evade your enemies, and use, common sense, instead of just walking into firefights like a headless chicken. Again, like Crysis 2, the only outright issue with this game is what I mentioned earlier, which is how it all just feels like it's set in autopilot mode. I mean, it's a difficult notion to describe, but I guess at its simplest form, it's like a been there, done that kind of sensation. There's really nothing new or groundbreaking on offer, and though that really is a product of the times and a good indication of the state of the industry, it does mean that the game can just be a bit dull at times. As open as the world is, there is very little interaction with it, aside from using the geography as cover or throwing around the occasional prop. You can hack the odd turret to turn it against your enemies, but that's about all there is to it. Enemies are either the human-type enemies or the Ceph forces, which function mostly the same, just with higher health points and more mobility. They'll patrol an area until they become aware of your presence, at which point they'll go into an alert status and then just start searching you out. That's about all there is to it. There's a couple of gimmicky Ceph enemies with the old weak spot that you need to target for massive damage, and also a heavily armoured troop that needs a bit more firepower to put down, but none of these are again all that original. Like most games, they go off something of a last known position system where they keep firing on the last place they saw you. Crysis 3 also has, I believe, the shortest length out of all the other games in the series. I think it can be finished in about 4 or 5 hours, maybe even less, if you avoid most combat situations, which is entirely possible due to the effectiveness of the nanosuit's cloaking ability. Now look, Sonny Jim, I can't stress enough the point that this is not a bad game in any sense of the word. In terms of technical proficiency, voice acting, all that kind of thing, it's incredible across the board, but it's just a game that doesn't take any risks. This isn't really a fault of the game itself. I mean, as I said earlier, this is really a product of its time. I mean, game developers just really seem to be running out of ideas these days, and following suit and rehashing something we're all familiar with is much easier than starting from scratch. I get that.
Where's your plan B?
Crysis 3 has its moments, I mean, let's give it that. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is that on the whole, it's just a very familiar journey, with mechanics and a narrative that just feels so uninspired. It's not really taking the series out with a bang, more so just kind of fading away peacefully in its sleep. But you know what, I'd say play it, check it out, kill guys with your predator bow and slit the throats of squid-looking aliens, taking out platoons of soldiers like a badass. Now if you're going to play one Crysis game, you really do have to commit to playing all of them, and despite what minor issues the games may have, on the whole, it's a really enjoyable series. And when it comes to shooting games, you sure can do a lot worse.